take a moment to introduce our speaker who so graciously agreed to talk with us. And I can't tell you, Ken, how excited I am that you're joining us. I was saying before, it was 7 years ago that I flew to Honolulu to hear you speak. And I met Dick Mosier, the president-elect, I guess you are, Dick. And he told me at the event, and he told me what a great organization this was and invited me to the annual meeting. And that's when I got involved. And so I was, I was so excited to hear you speak. As you know, I've been kind of a groupie of yours. I have traveled around the country to hear you speak at various venues, Pepperdine and IACP and American Bar Association, all kinds of things. And most impactfully for me, I call it in your living room. It may not be your living room, but at your house. I've been to a number of your mediation. They're not conferences. There's like 20 people. It's amazing. And the first year I went, I just started as a mediator, and I was pinching myself that I could be in your house in this small group listening to you for 5 days. I mean, I was just amazed. I thought, well, this is such a great field where you can sit in the leader of one of the leaders of the field's houses and have this kind of intimate connection and be a newbie. I mean, I was pretty new at that at the time. I've been back many times, but anyway, I am a groupie. I'm proud of it. And I want to also mention a couple of things that Ken isn't well known for. I think most people know about his I don't know how many books you've written, Ken, a ton, 20 something. You've spoken internationally for corporations and on and on and on. You have all kinds of credentials. You have all kinds of degrees. But the thing that really has touched me about Ken is he's not only a great intellectual, but he has a huge, huge heart. And just the fact that he's speaking to us today speaks to that, I think. And he does a lot of work with his wife, Joan Goldsmith, who also is a little more in the background, although she is, she's gotten a little bit more out there. And she's also a combination of somebody with a big heart and is also has a great brain and is extremely well educated and well read and so forth. So the two of them are quite the force. And they've worked on probably almost every continent and help disadvantaged people learn about, basically the future, how we want to be living as a world, and help mediators be trained and help them be effective in their communities, because obviously we can't go in and work in India as effectively as the local people can. So he's gone in and worked around the world in I don't know about most countries, but I wrote a long list of them. There's probably 60 countries you've worked in, many of which are economically and educationally disadvantaged. And I think that's really such a wonderful thing, because you just spread your knowledge so wide and far. And it's not a hierarchy. It's not like you've got to be somebody to have Ken work with you. And I appreciated that right off the bat, because I certainly wasn't anybody when I started with you. And you've had a huge impact on my practice. Your books, you can't read your books once. You've got to read them, 10 times to get even then you don't, there's so much depth and so much breadth in all your work that I just want to say that. So the biography is there if anybody wants to read it, but I'd like to introduce my friend and mentor, Ken Cloke.
Thank you, Tricia. That was really very sweet and wonderful. And it has been a pleasure working with you and with several of the other people who are on this call, who I'm very glad to see today. I'd like to actually say something a little bit different about my background, which is really two things. One, what entitles me to talk about conflict resolution, or any of us, are not just our successes, but our failures, the things that haven't worked for us, the things that we haven't yet approached. And because I've been doing this now for 42 years and mediated thousands and thousands of disputes, the thing that stands out to me is how little we know about this field and what it's capable of. The topic for today is going to help us look at the field of conflict resolution from a slightly different perspective. And here is what I'd like to begin with as an idea. Conflict is what in science is called a fractal. That is, it is self-similar on all scales. That is, there is something similar that takes place in the conflicts between two children on a playground and what takes place between the heads of nation states. And this is an important idea because what it does is it allows us to look at ways of shifting from a small scale disputes that all of us are involved in to doing mid-scale conflict resolution, for example, in organizations and in communities, to large-scale disputes involving nation states, cultures, entire communities of people. And what I would like to suggest to you is we understand just a tiny little bit about how this works even on the small scale that all of us work on, working individually from with couples, with neighbors, with co-workers, with family members. And yet, what we learn on those scales is something that has the possibility of being translated into some higher order set of skills that we can apply to other forms of dispute. The second point, if we ask the question, where are conflicts located? We can immediately see that there are at least 3 locations, each of which can be subdivided into sublocations. First, conflicts are located internally inside of us. And here inside of us, they're located physically, mentally, emotionally, and a series of other ways. But the point is, if there is a conflict inside of us, that is going to require a different set of skills than if conflicts are located in the second place, which is relationally or between us. So conflicts are inside us and they are also between us. And there are some of those techniques will translate from one to the other. Listening, for example, we need to listen to the sources of conflict inside of ourselves, and we need to listen to the other people who we are in conflict with. That's a simple example. There are other more complex examples, but not every technique will work on all levels. And the third location of conflict is around us. That is, in the systems and structures and cultures and environments in which we live. And most of the conflicts that we work on exist in all 3 of those locations, internally within us, relationally or between us, and largely unrecognized environmentally, systemically around us. If we take prejudice and discrimination and the conflicts that are created by it, we can see that one source of that conflict is people who internally within themselves have a set of stereotypes and biases about other people. And one way of approaching that conflict is by working with those stereotypes and biases and trying to dismantle them at their source. But that's very different from the conflicts that we will experience relationally between people who represent different races, different genders, different religions, different nationalities. And none of those will touch conflicts in their systemic location within our cultures. Because the techniques that work on a relational level do not always work on that higher level. So the question that we face is this: how do we translate from small-scale conflicts to mid-scale conflicts to large-scale conflicts? And now let's take a step back. And here is basically what we want to see. We are living in a world today that is in crisis. And we all know this. We see it around us all the time. And what I'd like to suggest is a conflict resolution perspective on crises. And what I would like to say as a beginning is, if we ask the question, what is the origin of the crisis? We will see that the origin is actually a conflict that is unresolved. And because it's been unresolved and continued and caused considerable damage and feels unresolvable, it becomes a crisis, which is simply a kind of panic that is applied to an apparently unresolvable conflict. Where did the conflict come from? Answer: a disagreement that was not resolved at the level of that disagreement. Where did the disagreement come from? Answer: diversity. That is, differences between people. So now we can see, we can reconstruct this program in reverse. If we have diversity, which we have everywhere, in every marriage, in every family, in every community, in every nation state, every religion, etc. If we have diversity and we do not have the skills to be able to manage that diversity, we are going to get disagreements. And if we have disagreements and we don't have the skills to handle them, we are going to get conflicts. And if we have conflicts and we don't have the skills to resolve them, we are going to get crises. And if we don't have the skills to resolve crises, we're going to get catastrophes. Why? Because every conflict is very simply describable as simply a problem we are required to solve. That's all. And now let's look at this from a political perspective, large-scale politics. What is politics? Well, there are various definitions of it, but here is my, if you will, interest-based or mediator's perspective on political conflict. What is politics? Here are three definitions. One, it is a social problem-solving process. And if politics is just a social problem-solving process, don't we as mediators have something that we can offer to help in that problem-solving process? The answer is yes. Here's a second interest-based definition of politics. It is a large group, multi-stakeholder, consensus-building process. That's another definition of politics. But as mediators, particularly those of us who've done environmental disputes, community disputes, a whole series of different disputes, and I know Chuck has done a number of these, and of course, Peter Adler as well has done many of these. If politics is a large group, multi-stakeholder consensus building process, don't we as mediators have the ability to facilitate that process of consensus building? Isn't that what mediation is? Except with a small group, it is a consensus building process. That's what an agreement is. It is a consensus build. It is the outcome of a consensus building process. And a third definition, politics is a conflict resolution process. Now that's an interesting idea, which is what is the nation state? What is an organization? What is a family? And the answer is, these are efforts to bring together a diverse group of people and hold them together, in part by being able to resolve the conflicts that arise between them. And if that's the case, don't we as mediators have the ability to say something about how we are conducting politics as a conflict resolution mechanism? And we are aided in doing this by something that I'll come back to in a little bit, which is the field, really, of conflict resolution systems design. How we design systems to make sure that conflicts get heard. And one of the great sources of conflict in every workplace and organization, unionized or otherwise, is that nearly all conflicts that occur inside those organizations, nobody's responding to until they get to a point of damage, disaster, cost, whatever it may happen to be, that finally somebody pays attention and says, we have to do something about this. Except in cases where there are ombuds programs that are proactively organized, except in cases where mediators are selected from within the workforce and trained in conflict resolution techniques, etc. But this is very different from the way that the world is organized, and it's especially different from the way that political institutions are organized. So, with these three interest-based definitions of politics, we can see that it becomes possible for us to say something about how political institutions are handling their conflicts. And how are they handling them? Badly. That's how they're handling them. Extremely badly. Why? We're on the brink of nuclear war right now with Russia. We are facing a war in Ukraine that is incredibly damaging for everybody living there, for the Russians who are fighting, for the Ukrainians who are dying, for the environment that is heating up and creating worse global warming than ever existed before. Isn't this silly? Haven't we evolved to a point where we can get to a place where people can talk to each other? And yet, right now, as we speak, the issue of whether or not Ukraine and Russia should be talking to each other is in contest, just talking to each other. And what this suggests is that we have evolved as a species to a point where what allowed us to survive in the bush, in primitive conditions, doesn't work anymore. We can't treat people this way. As people said in Paris at the climate change conference, there is no planet B. What is the consequence of that? Well, we treat Russia as an enemy, or China as an enemy, or any number of different countries as enemies. Where are they going to go? The answer is there's no place for them to go. What we have to do instead is understand that the way that we are demonizing them and creating enemies around the world is actually making the situation worse. It is not solving problems. It is not addressing issues. And if we could get to a place where we could actually address issues, there are a whole series of things that could be done that could help move this conflict, and could have helped from the very beginning, before it even began, to move this conflict to a place of negotiated consensus. Now, is that going to be easy? Heck no. In fact, as we know, it feels to most people, sorry about that. To most people who are in conflict, it feels easier to fight than it does to talk to each other. Ask any divorcing couple. They know that that's the answer. It's way easier to yell and scream at each other than it is to sit down and figure out how to talk to somebody who you have an incredibly intense emotional reaction to, who has betrayed you on multiple levels, and in fact, both of whom have betrayed each other on some level. Now, let's take a look at the situation in the world today. What are we facing? Answer: there are at least 5 global crises taking place right now, and perhaps a 6th, and we could even add a series of others. 1, there is a social crisis taking place around the world, sparked by prejudice, bias, racism, police brutality, violence, discrimination against women, hostility to LGBTQ plus people, hatred among Jews and Muslims, hatred towards migrants from the global South, Asians in the US, as a result of the a lot of the prejudice that's come out around COVID. And so we have this is a global crisis of social hostility, meaning, in other words, it is a set of social conflicts that have gotten to a point that people have become so frustrated that it isn't a simple conflict anymore. It is turning into a crisis or become a crisis. It depends on where you are in this, whether you see it as a crisis or not. Number 2, there is an economic crisis. We have a social crisis, we have an economic crisis, sparked in part by the global lockdown, but extending to global economic inequity, poverty, inflation, famine, prioritization of profits over people, a whole series of economic, and right now with Bitcoin, and the layoffs in the tech industries at Twitter and Facebook and all of these other companies. Once again, these are problems that have existed at a small scale for a long time, and we haven't figured out how to use conflict resolution skills to draw people into dialogue and negotiation over the issues that they are facing socially, economically. 3, there is a political crisis that we have faced in the United States. You can see it at January 6th, but also in the hyperpolarization between Democrats and Republicans, denials of the right to vote, neo-fascism, attacks on democracy, the war in Ukraine, and there was war in Yemen until mediators stepped in from the African Union, and just this last week stopped that war. So that's a step forward, but we haven't solved the fundamental problem. Number 4, there is a healthcare crisis sparked by the coronavirus, but extending to Ebola, bird flu, many other diseases right now, respiratory diseases, the availability of the unequal availability of vaccines, healthcare, rising drug resistance, attacks on the World Health Organization, the absence of an internationally coordinated, really led approach to pandemics, a whole series of things, but this is one that continues into the future. Number 5, an ecological and environmental crisis sparked by global warming, climate change, species extinctions, extending to air, water, and soil pollution, plastics in the oceans, fossil fuels and various forms of alternative energy, food production, and the possibilities of famine, et cetera, et cetera. Now, here's what is important about this. First, all of these crises interconnect, so that if you have a group of people who don't get vaccines for their coronavirus, and that infects their population, then there is probably going to be an economic crisis, a social crisis, because there will be possibly discrimination against those people, et cetera, et cetera. Each one can make the other ones worse and more difficult to solve unless we begin to solve the others as well. And these 5 crises can conceivably combine and create a 6th, which is a kind of multi-systemic or general crisis. And that's the one I think we need to worry about, because if we do nothing and we fail to address these crises in the ways that they need to be addressed, we are going to be facing potential catastrophes. And one of those catastrophes, it seems to me, is the potential loss of democracy. And this is not hyperbole, it's not rhetoric. This is very real. It's a very real possibility. And I think we can see that we have come close to losing it, and have actually lost it in a number of countries. Once lost, it is incredibly difficult to regain. Now, what does this have to do with us as mediators? And I think that the answer is this. I'm not advocating that everybody here give up their mediation practice and immediately go and turn your attention to saving the planet, although that's not a bad idea. But I think that what we can do is to recognize that the skills that we have learned can be translated into political problem-solving skills, political conflict resolution skills, political consensus building skills. And then what we can do is we can see that politics isn't the essential piece here. What that means to most of us, because we haven't really looked at it or thought about it very carefully, and if you want, you can look at my book called Politics, Dialogue, and the Evolution of Democracy. I think what we can do is we can say, wait a minute, we have a method for looking at this. And our method is this. We know that there's a fundamental difference between power-based forms of conflict resolution, which is like using military force, using police, using various forms of power, and there are many different forms of power, or using rights-based methods of dispute resolution like litigation, and interest-based solutions like the ones that we come up with, what mediation represents. Well, what if we thought about how to do that with government? And what if we thought about what can be learned not just at a national or international level, but at a local problem-solving level in the communities in which we live, on that by looking at the problems that we face from an interest-based perspective. And having done that, what we may then discover is that there are techniques available to us that we can learn on a large scale that can be translated down into a small scale, and vice versa. And now what I'd like to do is I'd like to shift focus for a moment. We'll come back to this in a minute. But actually, let me just read to you one really nice quote, which is kind of important for this. The quote is from Rebecca Solnit, who's a really brilliant writer. And here's what she writes. The first lesson a disaster teaches is that everything is connected. In fact, disasters are crash courses in those connections. At moments of immense change, we see with new clarity the systems, political, economic, social, ecological, in which we are immersed as they change around us. We see what's strong, what's weak, what's corrupt, what matters and what doesn't. And on some level, what I would like to suggest is that our experience mediating small-scale disputes between divorcing couples, between neighbors and communities, teaches us some of the techniques that would be useful on a community-wide basis for solving conflicts within our communities. And so what I would like to recommend is that you look for ways of expanding this work into schools, into workplaces, into hospitals, into local government operations. So, for example, many years ago, I was asked in the city of Santa Monica, where I work, to help create what had became the zoning ordinance for the city of Santa Monica for Main Street and the Promenade, which are major tourist attraction areas. And we had a 4-month-long consensus building process. What did I use to do that? All the stuff I learned in mediation. And what came out of it was complete consensus on the part of very hostile elements in the community, people who were zero growth, people who are real estate developers, all kinds of people. And that is the magic of dialogue. Now, the second point that I'd like to make, the point that I'd like to actually bring us to, is that some of this was discovered a century ago by one of the founders of modern mediation. And I don't know if any of you have heard of her. Raise your hand if you have heard of Mary Parker Follett. Okay, so a couple of people have heard of Mary Parker Follett. Mary Parker Follett is the founder of modern mediation in the US. She wrote in the 1910s and 1920s and wrote brilliant stuff. And one of the pieces that she wrote was, she wrote a book called The New State, which she wrote a lot about mediation techniques and about the idea of mediation. Here's what she writes about democracy. And I'm quoting from her. "We talk about the evils of democracy. We have not yet tried democracy. Party interests govern us with some fiction of the consent of the governed, which we say means democracy. Government by the people must be more than the phrase. We are told the people should do this, the people should do that, the people should be given control of foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. But all this is wholly useless unless we provide the procedure within which the people can do this or that." And then she goes on, "It is not merely that we must be allowed to govern ourselves, we must learn how to govern ourselves. It is not only that we must be given free speech, we must learn a speech that is free. It is not only that we must invent machinery to get a social will expressed, we must invent machinery that will get a social will created." And I believe that this is our task. And I believe that we've already started it at the level of each of our practices. And the question then is, how do we scale it up and apply it on mid-scale to communities and corporations and various mid-sized groups? And how do we do it on a large scale? Because if we don't figure that out, we are heading for catastrophe. And that doesn't mean that we will be able to avoid it, and it doesn't mean we won't be able to avoid it. It's just that is clearly the direction that we are heading in. And we know this. If you're in a marriage and there are problems in the marriage and you don't talk about them, what happens? And the answer is they get worse. People lose hope. They give up. They move on. And the same thing happens, except you can't move on at a political level. There's no place to move to. So we haven't yet figured out something incredibly important and powerful and unbelievably consequential. This stuff that we know is one of the principal skills that we need in order to get out of the catastrophe, to get out of the crisis, to resolve our conflicts, and return to having just disagreements with each other. and we know how to do it because we do it every day. Now, a couple of other pieces. The systems, the political systems that we have are essentially either power-based or rights-based. Now, many years ago, Plato and Aristotle and Democritus wrote about democracy and the difficulties with democracy and described how it is, Plato particularly, how it is that democracy can turn into an autocracy. And what he says basically is that, just essentially that people get into too many conflicts, and along comes a despot who says, I'll solve them for you. Here's a quote from Adolf Hitler, and it's almost a direct quote. The German people were facing very difficult, very complex problems. I made them simple. And what is simpler than two approaches to conflict that we all know about? One, there isn't any, and two, it's your fault. But the difficulty is, how do we get from there isn't a conflict or it's your fault into a dialogue about what needs to happen in order to make it go away? Well, each one of us has skills that we have learned in figuring out how to do that. And it is no different at a large scale. So Tricia mentioned the various countries that I've worked in, and starting Mediators Beyond Borders. And here are a couple of those experiences. One, I did a set of dialogues in Athens between Greek citizens and immigrants who hate each other. And there were hundreds of immigrants and citizens present in the dialogues that we conducted, every one of which was broken down into small groups. So most of the conversation took place in small groups. Here are the first two questions for each small group to ask each member of their small group to answer. Question one, have you in your life, in a family or a neighborhood or a school or a workplace, ever been the new one? And all the other people have been there for a long time. What did it feel like? How were you treated? What happened? Question two, have you ever in your life, in a family or neighborhood or school or workplace, been the one who's been there for a while and new people are now coming in and changing everything? How did that feel? What happened? How were you treated? What stories do you want to tell? And in two questions, people can begin to understand what it feels like to be an immigrant and what it feels like to be a citizen. Now we can start to talk. And magic happens in the conversation. Same thing in dialogues with Israelis and Palestinians. Same thing in dialogue between Russians and Ukrainians, Russians and Georgians, Indians and Pakistanis, Sandinistas and Contras, supporters of Mugabe and supporters of I've forgotten who the name of the candidate right now. It just slipped my mind. In Zimbabwe, etc. So I have done all of these dialogues, Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, in Scotland, etc. And what happens in these dialogues? Answer, people recognize each other not as the enemy, but as the thou that is a relative of the self. What Martin Buber called I-thou relations begin to arise between people, which is, I tell you my story and you hear not only the story, you hear who I am. You hear what happened to me, and you can find some semblance of me inside of you. That's what empathy is. And so is this any different from what happens in conflict resolution and mediation? Not really. It's just on a larger scale, except on the larger scale, we've got to break it down into small groups in order for it to work. Because if you tried to do this with 200 people, you couldn't get to first base. There has to be room for people to actually talk to each other. So what do we do in political conflicts? Answer, we have debates in which the goal is to publicly humiliate, personally humiliate the candidate on the other side. Does this have anything to do with solving problems? Not a single thing. And yes, of course, we want to debate different alternatives, but is there an opportunity for dialogue as well? What would a political campaign look like that was designed by mediators? Well, we can start to imagine some things. We got a problem here with gun control. How do we want to deal with it? Well, let's bring together people who are in favor of it and people who are opposed to it. Same with abortion, same with any number of other issues. And let's talk to each other about those issues. And then we have to design a conversation that will work. Question one in that design, let's say for the abortion dialogue. Here's the first question. What life experiences have you had that have led you to feel so passionately about this issue? And you're not going to get a speech about politics. You're going to get a story. And with the story, you're going to get the storyteller. And then we can start to appreciate that demonization, victimization, having enemies, being an enemy, none of this is useful. Instead, let's figure out what our interests are, why these things are important to us. And now let's see if we can create some magic. What is the magic? It's exactly the same as the magic you create in the mediations you do. Somebody says, I want this. The other one says, I want that. Well, we're stuck. Why do you want it? Now we're into an interest-based dimension. And why do you want it? And now can we figure out if there isn't some way in which both of you could get something that helps you feel that your interests have been recognized and satisfied without necessarily getting you what your demand was when we first came in? So every mediation that I know of that I've ever done started with a set of demands. I want this, I want that. And now what do we do with it? Well, the answer is we've got to get beyond it. Because if we stay there, all that's going to happen is we're going to end up with a compromise. And maybe that's the best that we can do. Sometimes it is, which just means we take two sums, add them together and divide by 2. I want $1 million, I'll only pay you 25 cents. So we end up somewhere in between $1 million and 25 cents, depending on the power of the parties, depending on their fear of losing, their confidence in succeeding, and a whole bunch of different factors. But the point is, it isn't just one thing anymore. We've got dozens of elements that enter into the conversation where before we just had 2. And that is a shift from a 2-dimensional conversation into a 3-dimensional one. And I believe that the same thing can happen in politics. Now, how exactly does this happen in politics? And I think that there are a series of ways that we can think about this. One is from the point of view of language. And the difficulty is that politics distorts language in ways that prevent us from getting to problem solving. How does it do that? By focusing on broad statements that are so abstract and meaningless that they can't be opposed, and yet they are. Excessive personalization of issues, negative frameworks that reinforce pessimistic images of the other side, adversarial assumptions that undermine trust, stories of demonization and victimization, all or nothing assumptions, demonization of all critics and independent actors, facades of personal outrage and affront about what other people have done, simplistic claims, formulaic responses, kind of a really falseness that comes out of a kind of script that has been created for political candidates. And as viewers watching television, you can watch the ads, you can watch the debates, you can see what is happening. Everybody is following a script. And the script wasn't written by the candidates. It was written by their professional political advisors. And those are people who believe that there is only one outcome of this, which is victory and defeat. And in debate, that is conceded to be the way that most debates operate. But in conflict resolution, we have a critique of debates. It doesn't have to end in win-lose. Is a win-win possible? Answer, absolutely, if we can get beyond the assumption that there is a single truth, and it is either one side's or the other side's. Now, we can maybe get to the fact that there could be another truth that is halfway in between, but there is another possible truth, and that is a creative synthesis of those two opposing truths. And now that is not an easy way, an easy thing for us to do. But the first thing that we have to do is we have to stop creating enemies and rehumanize people on the other side. There's a nice little piece that probably Tricia has from one of the courses we did together, which is called Elements of Demonization. How do you demonize somebody? One, you assume injurious intentions. They intended to cause the harm that we experienced. And we know this because what everybody says in response when they have a personal response is, oh, I didn't mean that to do that. I didn't intend to hurt you. Distrust, which means that everything that they propose is wrong or proposed for some dishonest reason. Externalization of guilt. So everything that's bad or wrong in our situation is their fault. Attribution of evil. And the big one here, I think, is the zero-sum assumption. And this is one that we come across all the time. Out of a total of 10, if you get 7, I get 3. But if I get 4, you get 6. So it's a fight to the finish. But it doesn't have to be that way. Neither politics, nor social life, nor health, nor having a successful economy depend on either or decisions, usually. Sometimes they do, and then we can figure out how to handle that, but that's different. What they depend on is a mixture of complex elements that have a little bit of yes and a little bit of no. And how do we get there? We have to ask questions like, if you were to accept everything that your opponent wants, if you were to agree to it, whether it's on the table or not, what would you want in exchange? Well, that's asking an interest-based question that is going to say, well, you know, if I were to have to accept this, here's what I would want. And now we've got something that wasn't even mentioned probably beforehand, but can be now. here's what we need to do. We need to develop ground rules, which we use for lots of interpersonal disputes, for organizations and communities, and for political institutions. And I'm working on a piece right now for a book that I'm writing, which is called Imagining an Interest-Based State, which is an effort to imagine what we might be able to do. So what can we do? We can conduct conflict audits at every level of government to identify the primary sources of conflict, the causes of conflict, how much they cost, not only financially, but morally, emotionally, culturally, politically, environmentally, and the costs are massive. Number two, we can form task forces that represent all political constituencies at every level of government and empower them to jointly investigate, discuss, recommend, and implement consensus-based policies that are designed to solve problems and transcend political conflicts of every kind. We can ask them what they think and how they would do it. We can bring in skilled facilitators into organizations and into governments and help them design processes, convene constituencies, facilitate dialogues, evaluate the root causes of conflict, reach consensus on proposals for implementation, recommend ways of improving government meetings. Just that alone would be worth the price of admission. How to improve interactions with likely opponents, discussions of potentially divisive issues, and starting with Congress. Or start at a local level with your own city government. Then help train people in dialogue facilitation and bring in those dialogue facilitators to conduct strategic planning meetings, problem solving exercises, empathy and consensus building and team building, and dialogues over hot political topics, not with the goal of saying, okay, we're all going to agree, because not everybody's going to agree. This has come from a long history and background, but we're not going to treat each other as enemies. We are going to disagree with each other, and we are going to agree to disagree. And it's rare that somebody will be converted. That's not the expectation. The expectation is to reverse the hyper-polarization and reduce it to simple polarization. That is, a disagreement in which each side sees something that's true. So if we're all in a room together and we're all sitting in a circle, every one of us sees something different. Every one of us has a different background. We've all been trained in the same technique, but I can guarantee you that every one of us will mediate the same dispute differently. And it'll be different at every moment. And the same is true with politics, meaning it's got to be pluralistic. We have to recognize that there is something true, not necessarily the assertion, but there is something true for each person in every conflict. This doesn't mean that it's true that you owe me $1 million or that I owe you 25 cents. It means why $1 million and why 25 cents. And now we're talking. And then I think in addition to that, we need to try to address some of the major social, economic, political, environmental conflicts using a whole range of conflict resolution techniques, including prejudice reduction techniques, informal problem solving, conflict coaching, systems design, capacity building, restorative justice, etc. If it were up to me, I would create a cabinet level mediation, office of mediation and ombud services at the level of the US government and the cabinet, with branches in every governmental agency and department. Assign ombuds professionals to every government office, train peer mediators in workplaces, and even have them elected in their workplaces and institutions. Then tackle the electoral process, figuring out how to redesign it from a conflict resolution perspective. Create multi-door courthouses, as were proposed by Professor Frank E.A. Sander at Harvard Law School, in which people come together in law courts, not just to sue each other, but for informal problem solving, facilitated negotiation, early neutral evaluation, summary jury trials, mediation, arbitration, etc. Not only before litigation, but during and after litigation. Create generic language like treaty language for all legislation, executive orders, contracts, agreements of every kind that requires alternative dispute resolution before going to court. And that provides the mechanisms for people to actually talk about the problems that they're facing. And the one that I think is the most important is to begin in schools training students from kindergarten through college to become mediators in conflict resolution, facilitation, etc. So the last thing that I just want to say is that, as James Baldwin wrote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And not everything can be changed immediately, but without a sense of some immediacy, nothing is going to change. And we are now facing circumstances today that force us to pretty rapidly figure out how to solve a growing number of complex, divisive, life-threatening global issues. And we have to figure out how to do it together because the problems we are facing can no longer be solved by an individual nation state. The greatest problem-solving institution ever created, the nation state, has been bypassed by the global nature of problems. It just doesn't work. It can't work. So now, let's just say this. If we were to do even a small number of these things in an incredibly insufficient, poorly funded effort, a half-hearted effort even to implement a fraction of these ideas, it could have a dramatic and transformational impact and point us in the right direction. So are we going to succeed? Nobody knows. But we do know that there's no hope of succeeding if we don't try. So again, Rebecca Solnit says, the grounds for hope are in the shadows, in the people who are inventing the world while no one looks, who themselves don't know yet whether they will have any effect, and the people you have not yet heard of. I love that. That's beautiful. And Mary Parker Follett, as we said, has given us a set of tools that we can use to, and the idea of applying interest-based conflict resolution to large-scale political issues. So we are learning these skills. I don't think that we ever thought when we began, I certainly didn't, that they might be useful in this area. But I think they are not only useful, they are essential if we are going to evolve to some capacity to live together on this planet. We have to figure out how to solve our problems together. We just have to figure that out. And my final idea for you, and then we'll open it up if you have time for questions, is essentially this. It doesn't matter whose end of the boat is sinking. we're in the boat together. And pointing blame at one another just doesn't work. We've got to pitch together and try to figure out how to solve this problem. So I'm hoping that this is useful for you. As I indicated before, I think that some of these ideas will not only translate into political options, but they will make you better mediators, because we are capable of learning things on a large scale that can then be applied on a small one. Okay, that was a lot to pack into an hour. I don't know what your time frame is, Tricia. For this, you probably have some other things that you need to do. But if there are.
Yeah, we have another 25 minutes that we're scheduled for. So that's great, because I'm sure there's questions. Can you hear me?
Ken, it looks like Ken just got locked up.
Uh-oh.
Ken, if you could hear me, I am real curious about the idea of fractals and conflict, because I noticed that after reading The Misbehavior of Markets by Mandelbrot,
Yep.
and he showed that, fractal nature of markets. And boy, I mean, I read that book and it was like how did you, I just thought, man, it reminds me so much of what we do in mediation. I've never heard it before. Anybody say that there's a fractal, nature of conflict, except I read it in the book and I was like, I don't want to sound too intellectual. Where did you get that from? I'm just curious.
Well, I read a lot of science. And so I've read about fractal behavior in science. There's a whole science around it. For example, if you take a photograph of the coastline of Hawaii, anywhere on the coastline, at 1,000 feet, it'll be essentially the same at 1,000th of an inch.
Mm-hmm.
The patterns, the in and out nature of it will vary in a consistent way. And that's self-similarity on all scales. The most magnificent, incredibly powerful view of fractals, if you could go online and find this, just look up the Mandelbrot set. Mandelbrot was the one who really created this. And the Mandelbrot set, its fractal is basically just anything where you take, for example, x equals c plus 5, and then c equals, then you just reiterate that over and over again. And so what the Mandelbrot set does is it shows how incredibly gorgeous this is at a mathematical level. With repetition on all scales, you can go 1,000,000 times down and it looks essentially the same. Every mountain range is a fractal. The nerves inside your body are organized fractally. Your intestines are fractals. A fern looks the same as a plant as it looks on each frond. A broccoli, a little sprig of broccoli looks the same as the actual real broccoli, etc. All this means is that nature has taken a simple way of replicating itself. And then I realized that conflicts are similar when I began doing large-scale conflicts and working in some cases with governments, in some cases with just corporations and governments and nonprofits and communities, and realized this is not that different from what I'm doing on an individual level with the mediation clients I'm seeing. And that was the opening for me. So I did write about it a little bit in a book called The Dance of Opposites. And I think in, it may have been in The Crossroads of Conflict. I can't recall.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. It's a terrific, wonderful, exciting idea from science. And there are many of those, many scientific ideas that work here, and mathematical ideas as well.
I just want to make one other comment more than a question. Like here in Hawaii, we had a big incident where the Navy leaked the Red Hill. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what happened in Red Hill. And what bothers me the most about the Red Hill is I'm a former federal employee, and we're offered a tremendous amount of protections from retaliation and firing and whistleblowing and everything else. So many of those good employees, good, solid, upright citizen worked at Red Hill and never spoke up. And that's disappointing to me that the system that we operate under, it says we encourage, people to speak up and everything else, but it's not practiced. And the problem is we talk about integrity, we talk about, accountability, but unless we do like role-playing exercises to actually get people used to and safe and feeling comfortable, they won't speak up. And Red Hill more so, I mean, Red Hill was a bad thing, but there's a systemic problem with the system that did not encourage people enough or did not train people enough to speak up, speak out earlier and more vocal to actually prevent this disaster from taking place. And I think that, I mean, boy, if there's an area where we could, politically, I mean, Hawaii's, have strong politicians that if there was some way we could improve the system in the federal government for employees, because they are protected, but they don't feel protected. There's a big difference between being protected and feeling protected. They don't feel protected to speak up, even though they have all these laws and rules to protect them. The feeling isn't there. And I'm disappointed that Red Hill happened so much. I mean, I'm a former Navy sailor and very proud of my service, but this is so disappointed in a group that I care so much about that took place. So I'm just going to end it at that.
Yeah, no, I think they're quite right in perceiving that it's not entirely safe for them, in spite of all the protections. It's a little bit like Samuel Goldwyn of Metro Goldwyn Mayer said, I don't want any yes men in my outfit. I want people who are going to tell me the truth and tell me when I'm making a mistake, even if it does cost them their jobs. And there's a kind of sense that that's what it is. But I'll give you an example of a case where we reversed it. And that was a school in which the superintendent had been criticized by the head of the teachers union at a public meeting of the board of the Board of Education, and that's his employer, it could cost him his job. And so we had a meeting together to talk about this. And the superintendent said, before we start the meeting, I'd just like to say something. So I thought, oh God, what's going to happen now? But I said, okay. And he said, turned to the head of the union and he said to her, I want to thank you for criticizing me at the meeting of the Board of Education. You were right and I was wrong. And I want to compliment you for having had the courage to criticize me. And I want everybody else to take this lesson. And you are going to be rewarded for dissent, not punished for it. Now, that was a gigantic shift. And by the end of the meeting, their relationship was just incredibly beautiful because he had done that. That was a courageous thing for him to do. But one way of doing it short of that is to put on every performance evaluation questionnaire for every manager. What is your score for rewarding dissent? Right? And most managers are not going to get a very good score for it, but if they're being measured on it, they're going to try to do better. But it's a great point that you're making, and you're absolutely right. This is the attitude we have to bring. And the attitude is one of ownership. We own this planet, and we have to step forward and do what is necessary in order to save us. Lou, you had your hand up.
Thank you very much, Kenneth, and thank you especially for your inspiring thoughts. I was struck with your comment that one of the most important things you feel that we could perhaps do is to teach what we feel is a life skill to all levels of students, school, as well as, I guess, people in government and in the working world. But I know Jose Barzola and my wife are struggling really to try to take the concept of peer mediation and grow and do something with it. I mean,
Right.
10 years ago, every school, every island, every district had peer mediation programs.
Hmm.
Today, there are only literally a handful. 2 high schools, maybe 3, and a few elementary schools. So the frustration of knowing the value of these skills and then thinking about how you can turn an institution around to also recognize it when, as a result of test scores and STEM promotion and all the other challenges that the school institution faces, they don't have the energy, they don't have the commitment, and they're no longer open to the thought of having conflict management skills taught as a good thing. I mean, that is a challenge in that institution. I wonder if you have any inspiring ideas about what can be done.
Yeah, I have been involved in a number of efforts to create school mediation programs and seen the same sort of thing happen. What one principal brings in, and everybody's excited about a new principal comes, they have no vested interest in that program at all.
Exactly.
There are a couple of things that make a difference. Well, and there have been some studies done of how school mediation programs can be made to succeed. One is there's got to be a dedicated teacher making sure that that program actually works and helping to run it and teaching classes in it. And I think the other piece that is missing is funding. If the federal government were to set aside money to fund these programs, the school districts would provide them. But this is just one way in which we have to rethink how bureaucracy impacts conflict resolution. Because a part of what we represent as a process is a non-bureaucratic approach to problem solving. We don't start with the rule, we start with the value. So we have value-driven rules. Bureaucracies have rule-driven values. They start with a rule. They start with the law and then go from there. So we can tweak the law in various ways and get laws passed. I think that the simplest approach would be for the federal government to provide those funds. But the difficulty is, it is in the best interests of bureaucracies to create more bureaucracies. They don't do well with what the kind of process that we represent, which is a non-bureaucratic problem-solving process. They're suspicious of it everywhere, not just in schools, but in other places as well. And the reason is because it's not power-based. So whoever has power maybe is going to lose it through this kind of process. It's not exactly rights-based. The idea is to get better than what's rights-based. So anybody who's stuck with what the law says isn't going to be that interested, as lawyers generally, litigators are generally not, with conflict resolution processes that talk about emotions and interests and things of this sort. They're not trained in that stuff. They don't have the skills to be able to handle it. And it also potentially could diminish their fees. So we have to see that this is a reality, and then we have to figure out ways of overcoming it. Parni, you have your hand up. I hope that helps, Lou.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I put my question in the chat also, but perhaps you did not see it.
Sorry, I missed.
Is, you know, when people have a strong belief in something and it's not true, and how could you mediate that kind of person?
Yes, this is a very good question, Barney. And here what we try to do, let's say, for example, that it is about within a couple, about whether someone cares about the other person. And one person says they don't feel cared about, and the other one says, well, they do care about them. Well, what do we do with that? And if we try to get into a battle over who's right and who's wrong, we have unsuccessfully gotten drawn into the conflict when what we need to do is to bypass it and to turn to a set of questions that reveal, why does that not feel like caring to you? And why does that feel like caring to you? What is one thing that he could do that would make you feel that he cares for you? And would you be willing to do that? Right? So in a similar type of way, if we take, for example, flat Earth ideas, or QAnon, or any of the idea that the whole election process was a fraud, or whatever, there are a whole bunch of conspiracy theories out there. If we try to engage in them at the level of fact, we're not going to be convincing. Instead, what we have to figure out is, why would somebody adopt this view? What does it mean to them? Who do they become as a result of this view? What are the consequences of this view for everybody? And can we reach a kind of depth of conversation that allows us to bypass the factual issues about where people are stuck? And we do this all the time. You did, no, I didn't. Yes, you did, no, I didn't. We don't try to decide who did and who didn't. We say, regardless of who did, is that something that you would like to see happen again in the future? No? Why not? What does it mean to you, etc.? And now we're on the way to an agreement. And they will agree about not doing it in the future. You yelled at me. No, I didn't. You yelled at me. Well, do you want to be yelled at? No. Do you think that yelling is a good idea? No. How about if we agree as a ground rule going forward that neither of you is going to yell at the other one? And all of a sudden, we have avoided a diversionary conflict that was designed really to get us into a conversation that was actually about something else. And here becomes the hard part. What do you get as a result of believing that the earth is flat? What does it mean to you to believe that? Who do you become? Right? Those kinds of questions then are helpful in trying to get to this deeper level of conversation. This is the dialogue. And what you find in dialogue is that people tend to give up the really crazy stuff that they've come into it with. And this includes Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, where, the other side just has horns. And you can see those horns, before you even come into the conversation. And now all of a sudden they've become a real human being. There was a wonderful conversation, amazing conversation I had in Zimbabwe between, I remember the man's name, Morgan Tsvangirai supporters in the election and Robert Mugabe supporters, in which the Tsvangirai supporters were shooting rifles into a house that had Mugabe supporters. These are young kids. And they later discovered their parents were in that house. They were shooting at their parents. And this was a big blow to them to realize that this is the case. And we had an incredible conversation about, what will happen if we try to resolve these issues by shooting each other. And yeah, somebody's going to win, and what are you going to get? you're going to get somebody who won by shooting. And what kind of government is that going to be? You know, et cetera. Those kinds of conversations are, I think, the ones that we have to figure out how to have. This is not easy. None of this is easy. And managing that conversation is really important. But what we do need to do is to step away from demonizing the one who believes in something that is completely untrue, and instead trying to figure out how we can manage the conversation in such a way as to get to some place that in which we agree on something that is true. Make sense? I hope so.
Yes, very much. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the question, Courtney. Okay, any others before I go?
I have a thought if there aren't any other people that have questions. Is there somebody else? One thing that I was struck by recently, I heard you on some sort of conference that you were participating in. I think you were a keynote speaker from India. I can't remember the person's name, but you went into colonization and decolonization. And I was pretty amazed at my lack of depth of understanding after I listened to you, even though I've traveled widely and I have been in many colonized countries and had some empathy about that, but I didn't have the understanding that you communicated, and you did it pretty clearly and succinctly. I just wondered if you would share that. I thought it was profound and has to do a lot with the United States as well, with the treatment of the slaves and so forth. So, you know, the fact how you tied it all together, I thought was amazing.
Well, thank you. It's actually become a chapter in a book that I'm writing now, which is called The Magic in Conflict, and I'm nearly done with it. But I
Good.
think it might be helpful for those who are interested. I can send you a draft of that chapter, and then you can circulate it to people who can, whoever's interested is welcome to read it and see if it speaks to them.
That would be lovely. Thank you. I mean, and when will the book be finished?
I have 3 more chapters to write. I've finished 9 really. And so it should be done probably March or April. I'm hoping.
That's great. It's going to be a wonderful book. I mean, that subject of decolonization and colonization is it's interwoven so profoundly in our culture and society. You know, after I heard you speak about that, I realized, I mean, it's no wonder we have so many problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And it fits in with a lot of the history that we know, probably that you know from Hawaii.
Yeah.
So it's not entirely separate from what people there have experienced. And well, I'll send you the article, and people are welcome to read it. There are other articles as well. One of my favorites is on the metaphor of mathematics, mathematics is a metaphor for mediation, which is a kind of exploration of mathematics and mediation, which is really out there.
Yeah, and you have an advanced degree in mathematics, I remember.
No.
Oh, you don't?
No, I study.
You should. I mean, it's amazing how much you know.
Well, teeny tiny compared to what is out there. It's such an incredibly amazing field. But as Galileo said, the universe is written in the language of mathematics. So that's a good reason for trying to figure out what it's all about.
Well, thank you. I'd love the articles. You're so generous with what you do. I appreciate it. And I'll send it to anybody who, well, I could send it to everybody here, I guess.
Sure.
Because I'm sure everybody's interested. The one on colonization, for somebody who, like me, has traveled to so many places and just did not get the depth of the damage, we're sort of trained to see the, oh, isn't it great? Everybody speaks English and they're educated, and there's a lot of whitewash that goes on. So thanks for getting me below that.
One of the issues I think for all mediators is that we have kind of insulated ourselves against looking at the level of damage that people have experienced in every conflict, at the real pain that people have. And I think we need to figure out how to open ourselves up to that pain, not in ways that are judgmental, but in ways that are honest and constructive. But the honesty is the first part. We have to have truth before we can have reconciliation.
Yeah. I'm just going to throw this out there because I've been watching the Holocaust, as I'm sure a lot of people have. And I've also traveled in Germany and done some work in Germany. And they are an example of a country who has looked at what they've done. Now, maybe not to the degree that they could, but they have done profound introspection as a country. And I admire that even more after watching a lot of the Holocaust. I mean, it's pretty, but that's gone on in so many countries in so many more quiet ways, and nobody has looked at it, including ours, So anyway, thank you, Ken. I really, truly appreciate your being here. You're a gift. It's amazing that you're gracing us with your time and expertise. So thank you. And I appreciate everybody coming to this and, sharing our annual meeting. We used to do it in person with dinners and so forth, but this has been wonderful for me. And I wish everybody a happy holidays. And thank you for allowing me to be your president for the last year.
And let's pray for peace for the people in Ukraine, both the Russians and the Ukrainians. I have a Russian orphan, and the people who helped us in Russia say, Putin is not the Russian people. We're against this war.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Barbara. You're absolutely right. Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you all for coming and for paying attention and inviting me to speak. I really do appreciate it. And thank you especially for all the work that you are doing. None of this would be possible without you. None of it. So thank you.
Can I get your contact information? Or maybe through Tricia?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sending Tricia now the chapter.
Yep.
She'll send that out to everyone.
I will.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Happy
Thank
holidays.
you, Ken.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much.
Ken.
Have a happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Yeah. Hi, Chuck.
Anybody's working on the TMT? I don't see Ken on this. I mean, Peter Adler. But if, I'm married to a native Hawaiian Portuguese guy, and it's still the major conflicts within our space here in Hawaii.
Yeah.
So contact me if you are still interested, if you have any ideas about how to open the conversation, which is now closed. Mahalo.
Okay. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.